Oops. Hi, Pyotr. How are you? Good to see you
I'm
here.
good, Ashley. It's nice to
Yeah,
see you.
good.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll be hosting on behalf of Mario, so I'm sure we have a lot to talk about, and we've spoken in spaces before, so this will be a fun conversation, just you and me, on some of the things going on. Over the last 24, 48 hours, there's a lot going on. We have negotiations and this U.S.-Iran proposed MOU coming out that gives potentially 30 to 60-day extension on the ceasefire. We have a lot of activity happening in the Lebanon-Israel front. A lot of this negotiation seems centered around the Strait of Hormuz. And, whether enriched uranium is part of the conversation or not. So I wanted to get your initial reaction on this, and then get a little bit deeper as well. Trump put out a Truth Social post this morning saying that he's really insisting, almost demanding Saudi Arabia, Qatar even join the Abraham Accords in order for this to work. So it looks like there's some kind of expansion on the regional architecture side of that. So I'd love your initial reactions to that.
yeah. Well, firstly, nice to be with you. Second,
Hmm.
I'm coming to you from Malawi in sub-Saharan Africa, so my internet is rather spotty. So hopefully I don't
Great
freeze,
so
but just
far.
in case. Good. Starlink is working well then. But anyway, just to react to your True Social mention, that doesn't surprise me at all. If anything, it confirms a hunch that I've had for a long time, which is that Trump knows that this situation is even worse than he could have imagined. And therefore, what is he going to try to do? He's going to try to save his behind by securing the single biggest change to the overall security architecture of the Middle East, which was the Abraham Accords. Whether you agree with them or not is besides the point. From Trump's perspective, they are crucial to his reputation, his legacy. And if he can guarantee that the Saudis sign on to that, that would be, revelationary. That would be a game changer, or so he would like to claim. So, of course, he's going to be pushing for that behind the scenes. But the bottom line with this is, first and foremost, this is an MOU, which, if you study international law, it has no legal weight. It is a understanding. We understand that we want to resolve this war. We want to stop this war, which Iran didn't start it. This was a war of choice conducted by the Americans or Trump himself at the behest of the Israelis, or specifically the ultra-nationalist government, right? This is a war that has been completely unnecessary and frankly only demonstrated how little the Americans have achieved in their strategic objectives. Within the first 12 hours of the strikes happening on February 28th, Trump made very clear that this was about regime change. And then within 2 weeks, the American government had walked that back or clarified, no, it's actually about eradicating the Navy, reclaiming the enrichment, eradicating the military, or incapacitating it, right? And none of those have been achieved. They've significantly dented the Iranian capacity, but 30 of the 33 naval bases or whatever outposts along the southern coast still exist. 70% of their stockpiles remain, and 70% of their launchers or launching capabilities still remain. That is, and the government is functioning. Mujtaba, he may not be in a great condition, but the president is still there. The foreign minister is still there. The IRGC is largely unscathed. The Artesh is still there. So this is not a way to claim a strategic win for the United States, or Israel for that matter. So this deal, if it's done, will be one of the most significant, to quote one guest that I had on my show, as you know, I run the single biggest strategic blunder since America's war in Vietnam, which I think is kind of obvious at this point, but it demonstrates that you cannot win war through aerial power alone. And it also demonstrates that if you go into a war of this magnitude without a plan for the day after tomorrow, you are in a very bad position. And I will end my opening point to you, which is simply that we can see the difference in strategical planning here from the Iranians and the Americans, because Trump's been changing his objectives. He's been changing his mind based on just what he says on Truth Social.
I saw a lot of it.
The Iranians, on the other hand, have been working with the Omanis. They've been negotiating with the Gulf states to find a way to make the Strait of Hormuz work. We can unpack that a little later, how it plays in with China and all that. But I would like to hope that this MOU can hold, but I'm worried about Israel's interests in Lebanon, as you may want to touch on, and a couple of other things as well.
Yeah, you bring up some good points, Pyotr. So there are critics that argue that the region was first destabilized, an effort then to push into negotiations under pressure to then stabilize it, sort of in this coercive diplomacy. Do you see it as a successful, even from an international relations and political science perspective and all the work that you've done, do you see this, do you think history is going to view this as a very successful coercive diplomacy, or more just managed instability?
Do you mean Trump's attempt at coercive diplomacy?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this seems to be how
you could
Trump
even
does.
say Israel in the region, but starting with Trump,
Okay.
of course.
Yeah, I'll start with Trump because this is obviously largely about the Americans and Iranians. Israel is there, but they're an extension of the US in this case, or at least in the Iran theater. In Lebanon and the Levant, it's different. But I think in this regard, the Americans, Trump loves coercive diplomacy, to carry the big stick in the treat or whatever, right? He loves this kind of approach. He tries to do this with the Russians. It doesn't work. He tries to do this with various other groups. And because America's the biggest power militarily, it sometimes works. But the thing he got wrong about the Iranians or the IRGC and Islamic Republic, is that it is a historical nation of thousands of years old. It is a very capable nation. It is a group of people who are incredibly intelligent and adaptable. And he severely seems to have underestimated all of that. The strategic patience that the Iranians have demonstrated in this war is remarkable. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm very critical of the Islamic Republic, just because I vehemently hate Trump and his war or choice or foreign policy doesn't mean that I support the Iranian regime and what it's been doing to the Iranian people. But, people lose the forest for the trees sometimes and sort of think that because you're more critical of one side, you fully support the other. It's like, not necessarily. It's international relations is not that binary, and anyone who tries to make it as such doesn't know what they're talking about. So in this case, I think that the Iranians have a pretty difficult situation, but they have demonstrated that you don't need to be the most powerful country in the world to go up against the US or to have a very capable deterrence. And coercive diplomacy doesn't really work always. Trump likes to use tariffs as a sort of stick, to try to force countries to play ball, but tariffs don't always work, and they're not a negotiating tool. And certainly going in to attack the Iranians in this way is not a successful method. And there's one big reason as to why I think this is a particular failure, something I'm working on a video for tomorrow. But we can go into that in a moment if you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to move to Russia and China if we can on this. China has continued defending Iran's energy imports. You've got Russia, on the other hand, also coordinating with China diplomatically, even behind the scenes, against the US and Israeli military actions. How do you see China interpreting this Hormuz framework that's built even within this MOU?
So I've studied China for a long time. I'm not pretending to be a Chinese intricate expert in its history, but I know their foreign policy very well, and especially in the context of great power competition. The Chinese have to quote Trita Parsi, who's been on the show as well, and I know he's been on here, they have their fingerprints all over this MOU,
right?
Or whatever, the Iranian proposals, right? Even if they are not in the room directly, the Chinese are absolutely fundamentally the main power broker in many ways than the Americans are. The Americans have the bases, they have the military capabilities, but the Chinese hold the economic and increasingly diplomatic key. No amount of pressure from the Trump administration is going to be enough without Chinese backing or Chinese input, at least. And I can say that because of what I've been told by some colleagues who were at Trump's delegation in Beijing. There's a reason that Trump came away after a pretty extended conversation with Xi. When Xi's talking about Taiwan in the way, and then Trump comes out with his own comments, sort of recognizing China's perspective over Taiwan and the reunification process or symbolism. That's probably because Xi told him a lot of stuff about the Iranian situation and how to get out of it, because we know Trump wants to get out of it. So China has a lot of influence in this. And obviously they're not immune to the challenges. They have reserves of energy, but they're not indefinite. They've probably got another 6 months, I think. So yeah, the Chinese are definitely involved in this. At the end of the day, they're known, some people think they're what's known as the status quo power, right? They benefit from the economy as it is. So they don't want global instability. That's why they don't support Russia more. That's why she doesn't really like North Korea's rockets and firing. And that's, to be honest, why back in 2015, when the JCPOA was established, China was a signatory. They signed it because they don't want a nuclear Iran either. So the Chinese are very invested in this. They just don't have as much of an overt appearance as, say, the Americans or the Russians or whatever. So, yeah, I think they will welcome this agreement. But, you know, I think what's going to be interesting to see is just how much they try to put pressure on and finding a solution to the Strait of Hormuz and, of course, the enrichment, which is still unclear right now.
Yeah. Speaking of the Strait, I'm sure you've also seen the news. There seems to be an escalation in the offense between Israel and Lebanon, specifically South Lebanon with Hezbollah. All morning I saw a report, morning my time, but I saw lots of reports, lots of strikes, statements. Even I think I saw somewhere where Bibi Netanyahu spoke with Katz and they agreed that they were going to actually expand it even farther and hit Hezbollah infrastructure and Hezbollah members harder. And they used very aggressive words. At the same time, from even a few weeks ago, I think it was like maybe 2 weeks ago, we heard news of even the Charles de Gaulle coming into the region. It looks like they're much closer there. There were some reports coming out that they're kind of in the area as well. How do you see this expansion impacting even the framework? Because in addition to this, Hezbollah even came out and said that the Lebanese government needs to step down. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, we stand firm on recognizing the Lebanese government as the official government of the sovereign country of Lebanon. How do you interpret what's going on right now with Israel in the middle of this MOU framework negotiation, with this all of a sudden out of nowhere, it seems a significant escalation in what's going on, and then European allies, specifically France, even being mentioned again and brought into the picture in terms of the Strait or the Red Sea or the Mediterranean area?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things to that. Firstly, let's focus on the Israel-Lebanon thing. So, the one thing working in the UN does teach you is how different countries interact with the international community, right? You see every country in the UN building, you see every country get an appreciation for the different ways. Is the UN kind of irrelevant? I know there'll be some people watching who will be like, oh, what's the UN got to do with anything? And sure, it's largely irrelevant these days, but as I say, from a personal perspective, it really opens your eyes to the complexity of diplomacy and international relations. And the one common theme that I've really come to learn from being there and also reading into the history more to sort of try to get a better understanding is Israel is often disruptive. They're a disruptor. And I don't like saying that because I've got Israeli friends, but unfortunately the Israeli government is often very disruptive. They interfere, they preemptively strike, they find excuses to engage in things. Just look at the Yom Kippur War or what's happened in the past few years with Gaza and everything. So point being is that I'm very fearful that the Israelis are going to, or the government, Netanyahu and the deplorable people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich are going to try to find a way to derail or, somehow, okay, let's pretend that the MOU is signed, but somehow they're going to come out and do something that will force the Iranians to be like, well, Israel has violated the terms of the MOU that we said.
Right, because the Lebanon front is a big part also, from my understanding, and from the latest versions, the leaked versions, from my understanding, the Lebanon is a significant part of this framework of this MOU.
Well, it wasn't like that a couple of days ago. That seems like a new addition to me. But yeah, that's what I would say is simply that if the Israelis are really going to go after Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Iranians feel that it's just gotten too far that they can't ignore it, then that could violate the entire thing, and we just return to conflict in the Gulf again with the Iranians and the Americans. So I wouldn't cut that out as a possibility. But at the same time, Trump is really fed up with Netanyahu. He's fed up with the manipulation, the exaggeration, etc., etc. So Netanyahu doesn't have as much sway over Trump, I think, right now, as he did. Let's say, remember when Operation Midnight Hammer was done? We were doing Spaces then together in June of last year, and Netanyahu had a lot of influence. But then for several months, Trump was like, "I'm tired of this. I don't want to," and we didn't really see much happen after that. And then obviously we lead up to February, and Netanyahu's like, no, now's the time to go. Let's go after Iran because they're much weaker. So it seems to be after some time, Trump is again persuadable or persuaded by certain parties. So maybe, in a few months. But yeah, I'm still very worried. And also just for the Lebanese people themselves, right? The country's been absolutely devastated from economics, COVID, conflict, and so on. So I'm very worried about that front. And then on the other point, the French and the sort of broader multinational. I mean, look, this has been a build-up for a long time. I think the French are just going there in largely a solidarity point of view. At the end of the day, the war has led to a new normal. I just got off a call with Anis of the expert in oil. He was talking about Hormuz, and this is a new normal. We're in a new normal where oil prices, energy, all that sort of thing, security around maritime shipping lanes is forever changed. It remains to be seen whether the Iranians can somehow financially control the strait with a toll. They've been negotiating with the Omanis, as I mentioned earlier on. So I think that the French are just reacting to this new normal in many ways, right? They're going to be sending a ship down there as a broader sort of effort to try to stabilize the greater region. But I don't think it has anything bigger than that right now. The key stakeholders are the Americans and Iranians. Everything else.
With everything else going on, and I want to get to Russia and Ukraine as well. I mean, we saw some escalations there over the weekend. But do you see, Pyotr, that globalization is somehow being weaponized, perhaps in a new way? We're entering a new era where globalization itself is the weapon, in terms of the shipping routes, the sanctions, insurance systems, naval access, the way that we're seeing the economy used as a new battlefield in the way that we negotiate things and in this new
I'll
world order.
In a particular way. I'll answer your question in a particular way, which is simply that when I did economics, I was particularly interested. We talk often about geopolitics, but I think geoeconomics is increasingly relevant as well. The securitization of economics like trade or energy flows or whatever it is. Everything's being weaponized or securitized. And this leads me to the broader point that I thought would be interesting for viewers, which is simply that what this war has done, I think, I'm still working on this, right? None of it's set in stone. But what I think this war is doing is single-handedly giving the Iranians strategic clarity, in the sense that for many years they believed that their biggest deterrent was to get a nuclear weapon. But that's not necessarily the case anymore. I think it's more the biggest single deterrent they have is control over the Strait of Hormuz. Their biggest asset is geography. And that's because they realize that they can create economic havoc at the flip of a switch by putting greater control over the Hormuz Strait. And that's because the United States is the backbone of the global economy, right? And for any people who are really nerdy about economics, they'll know this, but the US is both has the exorbitant privilege of being the reserve currency. It also has the reserve, is the exorbitant duty. That's a pretentious way of basically saying that when the global economy is crap, so is the US. And so if you have a global energy shock, like say in 1973 with the OPEC oil crisis, that really hurts the United States more. And so if the Iranians know, not only can they cause global havoc, but they can put a disproportionate amount of damage on the United States. And at the end of the day, that's what the US is all about, is money, or Trump is particularly about money and economics and markets. So I think that this is huge. And I think that the Iranians are going to very much try to control the Hormuz Strait in more ways than they can. And I think that's going to set a precedent for other countries that have a particular control over one specific asset, like a geographical one. You know, what happens if the Panama Canal, you know, Trump threatened to invade Panama again in his first 2 months of being in office last year, remember? That's crucial. And to your point about globalization, I mean, it's all interconnected, but I would argue that globalization has been on the decline since 2008. A lot of countries have lost favor with globalization. People argue about regionalization, the idea that we trade more and more with our closest countries. The Biden administration did this a few years ago when they started something known as nearshoring or friendshoring, which is try to decouple from China. This was actually a carryover from Trump. Yeah. That was the first Trump administration. He tried to do the whole decoupling thing from China. And so bring more production away from Vietnam or countries in Asia and put them in new countries nearer to America. So Mexico, Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just going to accelerate trends that I think have been happening for a while.
Yeah, you know, going back to the previous conversation, I just saw some news that came out. It looks like an Iranian official source has said that, has warned Washington that any Israel attacks on Beirut or this continuation, and of course right now also I saw some reports that there are fighter jets going over Beirut right now, but any additional escalation of this conflict, if Israel doesn't stop, essentially, it would seriously jeopardize the ongoing efforts to end this war and really jeopardize and derail the diplomatic track that they're on with these negotiations in the MOU. Do you see Israel stopping at some point? Do you see Trump getting on the phone and calling Bibi and saying, stop, enough is enough?
I do. I mean, look, I think it's very difficult to predict Benjamin Netanyahu, partially because we have an election this year with them. And the way that Netanyahu works, I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, right? But from my understanding and having spoken to Israeli people and experts on the show myself, is simply he needs to keep a distraction. It's like Trump with Epstein files in a way. Benjamin Netanyahu needs to keep distraction away from his indictment, right? He faces a lot of internal domestic issues, corruption charges, and ultimately he is keeping together a pretty fragile government. He's in bed with some, let's say, very unfavorable people, but he needs them to retain power, and he wants to retain the power. And the opposition groups, the more moderates or whatever, you know, supposed centrists like Naftali Bennett and co, they don't seem to have a clear alternative, right? At the end of the day, it seems to be the lack of alternative, like in the US with the Democrats, the lack of alternative to Trump. So I worry that Netanyahu's capacity to just sort of stay in power means he could somehow derail it. On the other hand, the Iranians do want this war to stop. The economy is not in a good place, and they need an opportunity to govern or to regain control, right? So I'm not convinced, if I'm honest. I'm not convinced that the Israelis will do anything, and even if they do a little bit, limited warfare, I don't know that would genuinely disrupt the Iranians. So I remain skeptical on that.
I have some concerns as well. I wonder how far they're going to go. And I also wonder whether or not perhaps Hezbollah is also trying to sabotage it, because Hezbollah stands to lose a lot if this negotiation goes through and Iran agrees to backing away from the support of any kind of proxy, and Hezbollah being the largest one there. So I think we're going to see over the next 24 hours what happens there. I want to shift to Russia and Ukraine for a little bit, if we have a little bit more time. Over the last few days, over the last couple of days, we've seen a lot of intensified attacks and strikes against Kyiv. We saw some nuclear exercises with Belarus. And then, of course, there were several warnings issued against the Baltic states from Russia. How seriously should we take Russia's latest nuclear signaling or military exercises? And what do you make of these escalations? You know, and I kind of also wonder if you can also look at this as, do we see multiple fronts happening at the same time, or do you somehow see some of this related in the larger sense?
Larger sense to what? The war in Iran?
Yeah, just in the region even, because, we had Trump just meet with Xi Jinping. We know that he has regular conversations, at least, on the PR side, we see conversations with Putin. But, and Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent, he actually allowed another round of exemptions to some of those sanctions that hit Russia to be used in some of their imports with Russia, with Europe. So it kind of is odd timing that this would all of a sudden start at this scale with some of these even nuclear exercises with Russia.
No, it's not odd timing. These are annual things the Russians do with the Belarusians. It's pretty standard. What's different is the nuclear element. Belarus has been largely out of the war in Ukraine news cycle for a couple of years. There was always a sort of suggested threat that Belarus would join the war, which they never would, because Lukashenko doesn't want to risk his position of power. Yes, he's very dependent on Moscow and Putin, but he's also been trying to hedge his bets with the Americans and Trump. That's why he released a bunch of political prisoners a few months back to try to, win favor with the US. He's hedging because he can see the situation for Putin is not great. It's pretty untenable. It's getting worse. And, these nuclear suggestions from Moscow are, well, it's hot air largely. The Russians are not going to launch nuclear weapons, mainly because Putin runs on a platform of restoring Russia to restore Russia to its glory. And therefore it goes against everything that Putin stands for to launch a nuclear weapon. I'm not saying that he isn't capable of doing that, but it is an incredibly irrational thing to do, because that would invoke, Article 5, it would invoke nuclear war. What he could do, and there's a lot of speculation on this, is a tactical nuclear weapon. So that's why the Oreshnik, the IRBM, right, the intermediate range ballistic missile, is very important here, because that is a missile capable of carrying these warheads. And so he.
And I think that's what I saw that he had shot, though, right? That's what he had shot. I think that's what I saw yesterday. Was it yesterday?
Well, yeah,
I think it was.
We can come to that. Yeah, it was yesterday against Kiev and some other sites. But all I was trying to make to the point was simply that he could launch a missile into the Black Sea, right? He could launch it to somewhere that isn't a residential area, so NATO doesn't respond. But he gets to show the power of a nuclear weapon, something like that. It's pretty far-fetched, but it is a possibility. Some people argue. As for the strikes yesterday, yeah, these are the biggest strikes Russia's done in a while, and that's because of the attacks in eastern Ukraine, or the oblasts that are disputed by the Russians and the Ukrainians. So this was an embarrassment for Putin, because the Ukrainians were able to significantly destroy a lot of infrastructure in Russia, and as we know, the Ukrainians are working on deep strike capability. I've hosted Malcolm Nance, you guys have him on often. He says the same stuff, right? Ukraine is massively and rapidly advancing its deep strike capability, not just into deep inside Russia, but into precision capabilities, the ability to take out specific targets in areas that minimize collateral damage, right? This is big deal. And that's part of the reason, you mentioned China as well, so I'm going to bring that in. Part of the reason Putin went to China. Now, I can guarantee you those two were talking about Xi's experience with Trump and Putin's in Alaska last year. And Putin went there with a specific goal in mind, which was to ensure a lot of deals were signed, and 40 were. And that's quite a big step. But the biggest one that Putin needs right now is the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which the Russians and the Chinese have been working on or negotiating for 10 years, I think, if not more. And the problem isn't infrastructure, it's not location, it's price. The Chinese want a fraction of what the Russians expect. And so all this BS about the limitless partnership and friendship is just that, bullshit. Because at the end of the day, these two have a relationship of convenience. It's a marriage of convenience. Are they, closely united by their shared frustration of the US global hegemon? Yes, but that's not enough to build a long-term alliance. And so when things come down to brass tacks or economics and money, we're seeing the limitations of that friendship. Xi Jinping has no desire to spend more on oil from Russia when he knows he can get it for much less because of the situation. So the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline has been one of Putin's biggest aspirations for years. His whole idea of shifting away from Europe and to the east is being limited because of China's unwillingness to bend over the price. So, it's a problem for Putin. The economy is absolutely terrible. His political position is worsening, and the war is not going well. So it's not easy for Ukraine. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Ukraine's winning or something outright, but it's just getting worse, and the economy is reflective of that.
So I was just looking at some breaking news. It looks like 2 IRGC Navy speedboats were just targeted by American fighter jets, and 4 soldiers were killed. It looks like Middle East Spectator must have got it from Farce News, I think. I'm going to keep monitoring that. But yeah, Pyotr, I guess like the final yes or no kind of rapid fire question. Do you think, given a lot of these things kind of evolving today on this Monday in the middle of this, do you think it's going to be a signed MOU in the end, or are we going to go back to the can getting pushed down the road, or maybe strikes happening again?
In all the years of working in foreign policy, be it in Africa or America or wherever, that expression of kicking the can down the road, it becomes more and more applicable in this situation.
Right? I was afraid to use it, but then I thought to myself, it really applies right now still.
Well, first you've got I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because I'll find the can of worms that I don't want to open. And so I'll keep that can down the road, right? I don't know, I just made that up, but it's the kind of bullshit that you'll hear from people, right? Because they just don't have an answer. And I'm going to go on a whim and say, I think it will be signed. Do I have, a crystal ball that I can tell you the future? No, but I base this answer on experience, and also just, I read the tea leaves. Don't look at what's being said as much as what's being done. What did President Pezeshkian do earlier today? He stopped the internet outage. Iranians can reaccess the internet.
Yeah, he actually, yep. And the Minister of Communication confirmed it.
Yeah, so that's a huge step, because it shows the Iranians are trying to loosen the security conditions for the Iranian people, which at the end of the day, this whole war was about. So I just want to reiterate this to people, right? This whole war, Trump suggested, was about liberating the Iranian people. And it's gone so badly that even the Iranian people are wondering, was this worth it? So probably not. But I do think it'll be signed. Because I just don't think either two have the desire for this war. Can the Iranians outlast the Americans? Yes, but I'm not sure about the economy. And of course, the American stockpiles is a consideration as well. So I do think it will be signed. But that doesn't, as I say, that doesn't resolve the two biggest issues, which is nuclear enrichment. At least right now, it's not included. But of course, most of all, the Strait of Hormuz. If those two things aren't resolved, and in 6 months' time, Trump gets bored again, he gets frustrated with the lack of progress in talks, we could easily return to this. We could see a repeat, because he got bored of all this in February and decided to go to war because the Israelis convinced him to do so. So I like to hope it's over. But our bottom line, we're not going back to March. There is no way we're going back to the level of intensity.
Yeah, I don't see that either. Yeah.
But we could go back to a slow burner of more April, May, where we see these flare-ups with naval vessels and things like that. But I hope it's signed, and that we can, see some improvements in people's lives with costs of living and everything.
Well, Pyotr, it was nice seeing you and getting to do this on video instead of just in a space somewhere talking. But I hope to see you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening in Africa.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to bed because I have a safari tomorrow. But
oh yes, enjoy that then. All right. Okay.
Yeah,
bye.
Yeah, absolutely.